What if the one place you swore you'd never return to was hiding the one truth you always needed to hear? When Violet Greene moved into the old cabin her father left behind, she thought she was just cleaning up the past. But hidden beneath the floorboards was something no one could have prepared her for. A secret. A voice. A truth that had been buried not just in wood and nails, but in silence and regret. This isn't just a story about a daughter. It's about a man who couldn't say, "I'm sorry," and the woman who finally heard him anyway. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. The last time Violet Greene saw her father was through the window of a hospital room, thin, pale, and staring at a world he'd already begun to let go of. He didn't say goodbye. But then again, he never really said much of anything. When the lawyer called 2 weeks after the funeral, she didn't expect anything. Maybe an old jacket, a watch, a memory she didn't want. What she got was a key and a hand-drawn map. No explanation, no letter, just a red X marked in the middle of a forest clearing 2 hours outside Eagle's Nest, Montana. Turns out, her father had been living off-grid for nearly 2 decades in a one-bedroom cabin surrounded by nothing but trees, silence, and secrets. Violet hadn't spoken to him since she was 16. She'd carried years of grief like a locked box. Now, she held the key to something she didn't ask for and wasn't sure she wanted. Still, she drove there alone, through fog, through memories, through the kind of silence that only opens when something deeper is waiting. What she found wasn't a cabin. It was a reckoning. The drive up to the cabin took longer than Violet expected. The road wound through dense pine and aspen trees, some so close their branches scratched along the sides of her old SUV like fingernails across old wounds. There were no signs, no mailbox, no path, just the faint remnants of tire tracks disappearing into a forest that looked like it had forgotten people ever existed. She followed the map in the passenger seat, watching for the small rock outcropping her father had sketched like a child would draw a mountain. When she finally saw it, she cut the engine and let silence press against the windows. She sat there for a while, fingers resting on the key in the ignition, eyes fixed on the cabin just ahead. It was smaller than she imagined. One story. Weathered wood, darkened by years of wind and snow. The front porch sagged slightly, and the tin roof was half covered in fallen leaves. It didn't look haunted. It looked tired. When Violet stepped inside, the air smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and something faintly medicinal like menthol or dried herbs. The windows were dusty but unbroken. Sunlight filtered in through slits in the shutters, casting long, thin shadows on the plank floor. The furniture was sparse, a rocking chair by the fireplace, a small table with one chair, a narrow bed pushed into the corner, and a wood stove that looked like it had been patched one too many times. On the wall hung a faded photograph of a mountain range she couldn't quite place, and above it, a simple hand-carved sign: "Do not forget what is real." She spent the next few hours in silence, sweeping, opening windows, shaking out blankets, trying not to think. But memory isn't something you choose to carry. It waits in the cracks. It was the floorboard in the bedroom that finally spoke. It creaked, not like the others. Deeper, hollow. Violet paused, broom in hand. She stepped back and pressed her heel into it. The board dipped slightly under her weight. She knelt, ran her fingers along the edges, and found something she hadn't felt in years: curiosity. There were 4 nails, old and rusted, and a small notch carved into one end. She grabbed a screwdriver from the drawer near the sink, still there, as if her father had only stepped out for a walk and began prying the board loose. Beneath it was a small, narrow compartment, no bigger than a shoebox. Inside, a bundle of yellowed letters, tied with fraying string. A small cassette recorder, the kind with the red record button and built-in mic. And a wooden box, about the size of a jewelry case, carved with the initials V.G. Her breath caught. She hadn't seen those letters since she was a teenager. She remembered them from the Christmas her father left when he walked out the door and didn't come back. She had scrawled his name across the envelopes with shaky handwriting, too angry to be tender, too hopeful to admit it. She never mailed them. She had tossed them in a shoebox. A week later, the box was gone. She thought her mother had thrown them away, but here they were. He'd kept them. Every single one. Her hands shook as she opened the wooden box. Inside was a folded photograph, her age 7, on her father's shoulders, both of them laughing, her hands in his hair. She didn't remember the moment, but it must have been real. Under the photo was a cassette tape, labeled in thick, clumsy handwriting. "For Violet, if I'm gone." She stared at it for a long time. Then she put it in the recorder, closed her eyes, and pressed play. The hiss of static filled the cabin. Then his voice, rougher than she remembered. Slower. Tired. "If you're hearing this..." I guess I couldn't say it out loud. I never was good at that. She swallowed. "I know you hate me. Maybe you always will. And maybe I deserve that. But I never stopped loving you, even when I didn't know how to show it." The sound of a chair creaked in the background. A breath. "I ran because I was scared. Of what I did, of what I couldn't fix, and because I thought you'd be better off without me." A pause. A swallow. But I watched. Not in person. But I kept track. I read every letter you wrote. Every word. I built this place hoping someday you'd come back here and know I never forgot you. Not for one damn day. Then silence. The tape clicked, and Violet sat there on the floor, alone in the quiet hum of the forest, tears slipping silently down her face. She didn't cry because he died. She cried because, for the first time, she realized he hadn't left her behind. He had just never learned how to stay. That night, she didn't sleep in the bed. She lay on the floor, right above the hidden box, with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and the cassette recorder resting on her chest. The stars outside were bright, cold, unblinking, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. Not mourning, not warning, just reminding that even in the silence, some things are still alive. The morning after Violet listened to the tape, the forest outside was cloaked in fog, thick and unmoving, like the woods had decided to hold its breath. She made coffee over the stove, the kind that tastes more like memory than comfort, and sat on the porch with a blanket over her knees. The tape recorder still sat beside her, as if her father's voice had taken root in the air. She hadn't planned to stay long. A night, maybe 2. But the cabin didn't feel like a place you could walk away from so easily now. It felt like it still had something to say. Later that afternoon, she started cleaning out the rest of the house. There was a small closet in the back of the bedroom that she hadn't opened yet. The doorknob was stiff, had to be jiggled just right, and when it finally swung open, a wave of cedar and dust poured out. Inside were boxes, mostly books, maps, a rifle wrapped in cloth, and beneath them all, something that didn't belong. A child's blanket, soft, faded blue, edged in satin, folded carefully, as if someone had held onto it for far too long. Violet stared at it, confused. She hadn't been a baby in decades, and as far as she knew, her father had never raised another child. She picked it up and a Polaroid fell out. A photo of her Not as a child, not a memory, but as a teenager, 15 or 16, standing outside a school bus stop. The photo had been taken from a distance. She was alone, not smiling, just waiting. She turned the photo over, scribbled in shaky pen. October 14th. She still wears blue. A chill ran down her spine. He'd been watching her. Even after he left. Even after she stopped writing. Even after she stopped believing he cared. Later that evening, as the sun began to fall behind the ridge, Violet noticed something strange near the fireplace. The floorboards were different, slightly darker, sanded smoother, newer than the rest of the cabin. She knelt down, ran her hand across them. Her fingertips caught on a thin crack between two planks, and then almost too easily one of the boards lifted. Beneath it, there wasn't a box. There was a hole, roughly cut, only a few feet deep, lined in stone and timber. Inside, buried beneath a layer of old cloth and plastic, was a tin lockbox. Heavier than it looked. Violet pulled it out and set it on the floor. There was no key, only a rusted latch and a faint engraving for when you're ready. She hesitated. Everything in her told her not to open it. That this box, whatever was inside, was the line between grief and something she might not come back from. But her hands moved anyway. Inside, several envelopes, each marked with dates stretching over 20 years. A small cloth pouch, inside which lay a silver bracelet she hadn't seen since she was 12. And finally, a stack of notebooks, wrapped in twine. Violet opened the top one. On the first page, her father's handwriting. I was never brave enough to speak, so I wrote instead. They were in diaries. They were letters. To her, every week. Sometimes every day. Pages and pages of unsent, unseen words. Her father writing through birthdays he missed, holidays that passed without calls, moments she thought he'd forgotten. Happy 18th. Vi, you probably hate me now. That's okay. I just wanted you to know I thought about you all day. I'm so proud of you, even from far away. I saw your photo in the local paper, winning the debate championship. You looked just like your mom that day. I found your blue scarf on the fence last winter. I didn't touch it, just sat there and cried. Each word chipped away at a story Violet thought she knew. Her father hadn't disappeared. He had been grieving her, too, from the other side of the silence. She sat there until it was dark. The box open beside her, the letters covering the floor like a sea of sorrow finally released. And then, the generator died. The lights flickered once, and the cabin dropped into silence. Violet stood slowly, hands trembling. She reached for the flashlight on the table, but it wouldn't turn on. She turned toward the window. Fog. Still thick, still unmoving. But this time, there was a shape in it. Human, still, standing just beyond the glass. She froze. Heart pounding. It didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there, watching. She blinked. Gone. She ran outside barefoot into the cold, breath sharp in the air. No one! Only the crunch of leaves beneath her, and the sound of her own blood in her ears. She turned back towards the cabin, chest rising and falling. And then she saw it. On the front porch, a single blue scarf, folded neatly, placed exactly where she would see it. She hadn't brought it. She hadn't owned it in years. But it was hers. Undeniably hers. Violet walked back inside, scarf in hand, and whispered into the empty room. Okay, Dad, I'm listening now. And for the first time, she felt the cabin breathe. The next morning, something in Violet had changed. Not a loud shift, no fireworks or revelations. Just a quiet unraveling. Like a tight knot in her chest had finally loosened its grip after years of silence. She made coffee, again, Same stove, same chipped mug, but it tasted different this time. Not because the coffee had changed, but because she no longer felt like a stranger in the cabin. She felt like someone who had just walked into a conversation that had been waiting decades to finish. She took the entire day to go through the letters. She read until her eyes stung, until her fingers were covered in ink smudges, until the sun dipped low and the walls of the cabin turned gold with the evening light. Her father's words weren't just apologies. They were confessions, stories he'd never told. About his mistakes, his fears, the truth about why he left her and her mother that cold December morning. I was ashamed. Vi, I wasn't strong like you needed me to be. I had dreams I gave up on, and I didn't want you to see the man I had become. I didn't know how to be a father, so I ran, and then I hated myself for it. Every single day. She held one letter to her chest, eyes shut tight, as if pressing it hard enough could bring his heartbeat back through the paper. She whispered, "You should have just come home." But deep down, she knew. This was his way of coming home. By mid-afternoon, Violet stepped outside for air. The fog had finally lifted. Sunlight poured through the trees in long, golden columns. The stillness no longer felt like emptiness, it felt sacred. Like the forest was honoring the silence they'd both kept for too long. She walked around the back of the cabin where she'd noticed a small trail. It curved along the edge of a stream, where smooth stones had been stacked into little towers' cairns, like someone had been marking time in stillness. Her father had built them, one for each year, each regret. She didn't know, but she added her own stone to the top of the tallest one, a peace offering. That night, she lit a fire in the old hearth, not because it was cold, but because it felt right. The flames crackled softly, echoing against the logs, flickering across the old photograph still hanging on the wall, the one of the mountains. She stared at it for a while, until something caught her eye. A name carved faintly into the frame. Pine Ridge, where we watched the sunrise. Summer '94. She hadn't remembered that summer until now. They had taken a trip brief, awkward, the last one before everything fell apart. She remembered the long hike, how her dad carried her on his shoulders the last mile, how he'd pointed to the sun as it broke across the horizon and whispered, "Some moments are worth waking up early for." She had forgotten that until now, the way children forget the soft parts first. She pulled out the recorder again, played the tape once more. Her father's voice filled the room like a ghost that wasn't trying to scare her but to stay. She let it wash over her. Not to hurt, but to heal. And somewhere, in the crackling of the fire, she could almost hear him again, his real voice, not the one frozen on magnetic tape, the one that used to hum while fixing the car, the one that told her bedtime stories that always ended too soon. Violet stood up. She walked over to the table, cleared the letters gently, and reached into her backpack for her notebook. She hadn't written in it since her mother passed away. It had felt pointless. But now, with the fire beside her and the scent of pine still clinging to her jacket, she opened it and began to write. Not to her father, but to herself. "I'm sorry for holding on to all the silence, for building walls out of pain, for forgetting that sometimes the people we lose are just waiting to be found in the places they loved most. I think I found you, Dad. And maybe I'm starting to find me too." She closed the journal, folded the scarf, placed it beside the photo, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel broken. She felt mended not perfectly, but honestly, that night, just before drifting into sleep, she whispered into the dark, "I forgive you." And from somewhere in the rafters above, a quiet creak sounded, the kind that comes when a house exhales. The first real snow came just days after Violet found the last of the letters. It dusted the roof of the cabin like powdered sugar, softening the hard lines of the wood and smoothing over the scars of time. The trees, once looming and distant, now stood in quiet witness branches bowed, as if the forest itself had decided to listen. Violet stood at the window, arms crossed over her chest, watching it fall. She was no longer waiting for a sign. She was the sign now. That morning, she started sorting through her father's journals, not the ones meant for her, but the ones he'd written only for himself. Most were stacked in a wooden crate in the back closet, labeled simply unfinished. Inside were stories, sketches, bits of poetry scrawled in the margins, blueprints for projects he never built, ideas he never dared speak aloud. Pages upon pages of almost the kind of things a man dreams up when the world has stopped asking him what he's capable of. But one entry stood out. It was dated just 6 months before he passed. If Violet ever finds this place, maybe she'll see more than what I left behind. Maybe she'll build what I couldn't. She closed the journal slowly, and something shifted. That afternoon, she drove into the nearest town, Kittredge, population barely 500. A quiet place, tucked against the mountains, with a post office, a diner, and not much else. At the diner, she sat alone by the window and ordered a black coffee. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a kind smile, tilted her head when she saw Violet's name on the check. Greene, any relation to Thomas Greene? Violet hesitated. He was my father. The woman nodded, setting down the mug. He used to come through once a month. Sat right there in that same seat. Didn't say much, but he always left $1 more than the bill. Violet smiled. That sounded about right. He was quiet, she said. The woman touched her shoulder gently, but he was kind. People noticed, even if he didn't think they did. Later that week, Violet returned to the cabin with a stack of supplies and a notebook full of sketches. Something had taken root in her. Not obligation, not guilt, but possibility. She started small, fixing the porch steps, clearing the overgrown path behind the house that led down to the stream, replacing broken window panes with fresh glass. Then she turned her focus inward. The living room became a space of warmth again, firewood stacked neatly, old books lining the shelves, photos reframed and placed back where they belonged. She transformed the bedroom closet into a small reading nook with a hand-stitched cushion and a lantern that glowed amber at night. Her father's journals found a home there. So did hers. By spring, the cabin didn't just look different. It felt different. It no longer echoed with what was lost. It pulsed with what was possible. And then the idea came. It wasn't loud, just a quiet nudge in her chest one night as she watched the fire crackle. What if this cabin didn't have to be hers alone? What if this place, so full of silence and memory, could become a space where other people came to listen, too? To slow down, to grieve, to begin again. Just like she had. She built a website. Simple. No frills. Just a photo of the woods, the stream, the cabin, and a message. A place to pause, to remember, to rebuild. She called it the Listening House. Within a month, she had 5 inquiries. By the end of summer, her first guest arrived. A woman from Kansas, recently widowed, then a teacher from Oregon, struggling with burnout, a veteran from Ohio who hadn't slept through the night in 3 years. They came with their silence, and left with something like peace. Violet didn't call it a retreat. She didn't promise healing. She simply gave people a place to sit with their stories and let the woods do the rest. She cooked simple meals, shared quiet fires. Sometimes, she read them her father's letters. Sometimes, she helped them write their own. And when they left, they each placed a stone by the stream, like a promise, or maybe a prayer. One night, as autumn rolled around again, Violet stood outside under the stars. She wore her scarf, the blue one, the one her father had somehow returned to her. Around her, the forest was still, not empty, just calm. She whispered into the dark. "You gave me more than I ever knew. I hope I'm giving it back now." From somewhere deep in the trees, a wind stirred the leaves. It wasn't a voice, but it felt like one. Not all endings are loud. Some arrive on quiet feet. Through healing, through courage, through the slow rebuilding of something once believed broken. Violet Greene didn't find a house. She found a home, for herself, and for every soul still learning how to begin again. It was a rainy afternoon when Violet received the letter. It had no return address, just her name, written in delicate cursive, and the cabin's P.O. box in town. She sat by the window as thunder rolled over the mountains, holding the envelope in her hand like it might burn her if she opened it too quickly. Something in her gut said this isn't from a stranger. Inside was a single page. "You don't know me, but I knew your father. My name is Daniel. He helped me when no one else would. He saved me. I thought you should know that he mattered, even when he didn't think he did." There was no contact info, just those few words. Violet sat frozen for a long time. Then she began to cry. Not the sudden, sharp sobs of grief, but the quiet, rolling kind, like waves lapping at a shore that had forgotten it was meant to be touched. That night, she opened her father's last journal, one she hadn't dared to read yet. The final one. Inside, on the first page, was a letter addressed simply, "For when she's ready to forgive me." She turned the page, and read, "There was a boy who came to the woods in 2008. He was scared, maybe 18. He'd been through hell, ran away from a place no kid should ever have to be. I let him sleep here, fed him, sat by the fire with him 3 nights in a row. He never said what he was running from. I didn't ask. I just told him the truth. Sometimes surviving is enough. Sometimes that's all the story we get to tell." He cried, then left. I never saw him again. But I hope he made it. I hope he found peace. Violet exhaled slowly, hand trembling as she closed the book. "You weren't just a man who left," she whispered. "You were a man who gave, quietly, invisibly." She wasn't just forgiving him now. She was beginning to understand him. Weeks passed. Then months. The listening house had become more than an idea, it was alive. Word had spread, not online, not through ads, but through whispers, through people who left the cabin and told others. "You need to go there. Something about that place stays with you." One morning, Violet stood at the base of the cairns near the stream, watching as a guest placed a stone atop one of the towers. It was a young man, mid-20s. Grief etched deep into his eyes. He didn't say much, but before he left, he gave her a folded piece of paper. "This place gave me the strength to keep breathing." It read, "I hadn't done that in years. Thank you for giving the silence a voice." Violet tucked the note into the journal she kept behind the front desk, then added another log to the fire. But it wasn't just the guests who were changing. She was changing too. The woman who had arrived at the cabin lost. Bitter, exhausted, she was no longer just surviving. She was creating. She started drawing again. Watercolors of the stream, the porch, the sunrise over Pine Ridge. She'd stopped painting after her mother died. It had felt pointless, empty. But now, each brushstroke felt like a conversation with the part of herself she'd buried. One morning, while organizing the supply shelf, she found an old wooden box tucked behind a pile of spare blankets. Inside was her father's sketchbook. The pages were filled with drawings, some shaky, some precise but all full of life. Scenes of the forest, of the stream, of her as a little girl, her holding a flower, her asleep in the back seat of their old truck, and beneath one sketch, in careful pencil. She never stopped being my light, even when I couldn't find my way back. Violet sat on the floor of the supply room and wept. One evening, near the anniversary of her father's passing, she hosted something she called the Night of Letters. She invited former guests back. Some drove hundreds of miles, others flew. They gathered around the fire pit out back, wrapped in blankets, holding mugs of tea and cider. One by one, they stood and read a letter aloud, not to someone still living, but to someone they'd lost, someone they never got to say goodbye to. When it was Violet's turn, she stood up with her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck and read a single line. "Dear Dad, you didn't die a ghost. You lived as a quiet kind of hero, and I'm proud to carry your story now." There wasn't a dry eye in the circle. Not because it was sad, but because it was true. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Violet walked out onto the porch alone. Snow had begun to fall again. Gently this time. Soft and slow, as if the sky itself was blessing the ground. She looked up at the cabin, its windows glowing warm against the dark, and whispered into the night. "You left me something better than answers. You left me a reason to stay." And in the hush of falling snow, something in the trees stirred. But it wasn't fear. It was peace. The kind that lingers. The kind that grows. The kind that says, "You're no longer running. You're finally home." The sun rose quietly on the final morning of winter. A gentle golden light crept across the floorboards of the old cabin, warming the wood. Flickering across the pages of open journals and dust motes suspended like memories in mid-air. Violet Greene stood at the doorway, arms wrapped around a warm mug, watching the light spill through the trees as if the world itself was finally exhaling. It had been a year, one full year since she first arrived at the cabin, since she unlocked the floorboards, since she found the letters, since her father's voice came back from the silence. But in many ways, it felt like her life had only just begun. The listening house had become more than she ever imagined. It wasn't famous. There were no influencers tagging it, no big features in glossy magazines. But every month, someone new came, and when they left, they took something with them. Peace, clarity, the courage to say something out loud they had buried for far too long. One man came after losing his wife in a car crash. He left with a poem. A woman brought her daughter, who hadn't spoken in 2 years. She left a drawing on the cabin wall. A teenage boy left a note in the mailbox that simply read, "I don't want to disappear anymore. Thank you." Violet never asked questions. She simply listened. And the forest listened too. Each evening, she would walk the trail behind the cabin to the cairns near the stream. What began as a handful of stacked stones had now become a growing monument, a landscape of remembrance. Some stones had names carved into them. Some had words forgiveness, hope, Dad, me. Some were just left bare, small, quiet offerings. She never moved them, never rearranged. Just added her own from time to time, whispering. For those who were never heard, and those who are still learning how to speak. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, Violet found a dusty cardboard box she hadn't seen before. Inside was a collection of old VHS tapes. On one was a strip of masking tape with 2 words in her father's handwriting. "First snowfall." She took it into town, to the little repair shop that still had a functioning player. The man behind the counter threaded the tape into the machine, and the screen flickered to life. There, in grainy color, was her 7 years old, laughing, running through the first snow of the season with a red scarf trailing behind her like a comet. "Behind the camera," her father's voice. There she is, my brave girl, Violet in the snow. Nothing stops her. She covered her mouth, tears spilling silently. He had filmed it. He had kept it. All these years. That night, back at the cabin. She replayed those words in her mind. Nothing stops her. And for the first time, she believed it. Spring came early that year. The snow melted into soft moss. The stream ran faster. Wildflowers pushed through the forest floor like survivors refusing to be silenced. Violet planted a garden near the porch, not just for food but for beauty. Lavender for peace, chamomile for rest, forget-me-nots for everything that should never be forgotten. Each guest who came helped tend it. They called it the growing place. Not a garden, a symbol of what happens when wounds are given time, when silence is given space, when pain is not erased, but gently held. On the anniversary of her father's passing, Violet held a candlelight gathering. 12 guests stood in a circle around the fire pit. Each carried a single flame, their faces lit in gold and shadow. She read aloud one of the last letters her father ever wrote. To live is not to escape what hurts. It is to love through it, even when it breaks you, even when you must build yourself from pieces. That's what you taught me. Vi, I hope I taught you something too. She folded the letter gently, looked around the circle, and said, We are not broken people. We are people who broke and built something beautiful out of it. After everyone went to sleep, Violet sat alone by the fire. The wind danced softly through the trees, and she thought about her mother, her father, her younger self. All the voices that had once lived in pain now lived in peace. She whispered into the night, Thank you for giving me back my voice. I promise I'll use it well. In the years that followed, the cabin remained. Not frozen in time, but alive. Season after season, it opened its doors, and people came, not to be saved, but to be seen. Some stories end with a door closing. This one ends with a door left open and a light always on inside. For the wanderers, the grievers, the healers, and the daughters who returned to a place they once feared, only to find they were never alone. Not really. Not ever. Anyone can begin again if they're willing to face the silence and stay long enough to listen. As spring sunlight filtered gently through the trees outside the listening house, Violet Greene opened a new page in her journal, not to write about grief, but to sketch out a plan for others, a space for healing, a space for hope. This wasn't just her story anymore. It now belonged to the daughter who never got to say goodbye, to the father who never knew how to say, I'm sorry, to the strangers who arrived lost and left lighter. The broken girl who once thought she'd been abandoned had become the woman who opened the door so others wouldn't have to suffer in silence. Because for Violet and for anyone brave enough to return to what hurt, healing isn't the end of the story. It's where the real story begins. The end. Up next, 2 more soul-stirring stories are waiting for you. Click to continue the journey, and if you believe silence deserves to be heard, hit subscribe.